At some point in your 40s, 50s, or maybe 60s, you'll walk into a room and you won't remember why you're there. You'll assume the worst. But what if the story your brain is telling you about getting older is wrong in almost every direction that matters? In this episode, I'll be talking about aging, specifically what's happening to your brain and your psychology as you get older. And I don't mean the popular narrative of inevitable decline. I'm really referring to the research, which turns out to be considerably more interesting and remarkably more encouraging than most men have been led to expect. So, by the end of the episode, you should have an understanding about what actually declines with age, what doesn't, and what, in several important respects, genuinely improves. And you'll also have a clearer picture of what aging actually means. Let's get into it. So, you've walked into that room and you've forgotten why. This happens to most people at some point. It's just not exclusively to do with men, and around their 40s or 50s they just anticipate the worst. The response, the immediate, probably slightly alarming response, is to assume that something's gone wrong, that maybe it's the beginning of the decline, the first sign of a long and undignified journey towards not knowing what day it is. But here's the answer. Some of what changes with age is real, and some of it isn't what you actually think it is. And some of what's happening in your brain as you get older is actually going in the other direction entirely. The psychology of aging is considerably more interesting than the popular narrative, and the popular story, that one about slow, inevitable deterioration, isn't only incomplete, in some respects it's completely wrong. So I want to start with what actually changes. So, let's say the brain does change with age. It's pointless to pretend otherwise. So things like processing speed, which is the rate at which the brain handles new information, that does begin a gradual decline, but it's actually much earlier than you might think. It actually starts in the late 20s. For most people, it doesn't become actually noticeable until around your 50s or 60s. Working memory, that's a system that holds information in mind while you're actively using it, also shows age-related changes. But not everything declines, and in some cases things actually improve. For example, crystallized intelligence. This is what you can think of as accumulated knowledge, vocabulary, pattern recognition. It's that kind of practical wisdom that builds over a lifetime, and it holds up well into old age. For many people, it actually continues to increase. So the ability to regulate emotion, that also tends to improve with age, and so does what researchers call integrative thinking, and that's the capacity to hold complexity, tolerate ambiguity, and see the bigger picture. These aren't trivial abilities. They are, if anything, the abilities that matter most, and in the situations that matter most. Here's the way I'd put it. The brain at 60 isn't a worse version of the brain at 30. It's just a different tool. It's more suited to some things, and it's less suited to others. Whether you've experienced this as a decline depends entirely on what abilities you're measuring and why. One of the less discussed aspects of aging is the shift in how time is perceived and prioritized. Not surprisingly, younger people tend to be future-oriented. They're busy accumulating knowledge, they're making contacts, they're gaining new experiences, and they're gradually going about improving their status. Older people, by contrast, tend to orient towards the present, towards meaning, depth, and emotional quality rather than breadth. So in practical terms, this often looks like a gradual editing of life. Relationships that feel hollow start to feel not just unsatisfying, but actively not worth the effort. Work that used to feel urgent begins to feel less so. Experiences of genuine pleasure, a good meal, a walk, an absorbing conversation, they start to take on a weight that they didn't have before. This isn't giving up. It's more a recalibration of what actually matters. And the research suggests it's associated with greater life satisfaction in later years, not less. Men often experience this shift with a certain level of confusion, particularly those who've spent decades in roles as provider, professional, achiever, because they were all largely future-oriented. The internal movement towards the present and meaningful can feel a bit uncomfortably like giving up. Well, it isn't. For many men, identity has been built around doing rather than being. It's been about career, competence, productivity, the capacity to provide and protect. These aren't superficial aspects of self, of course they're not. They are, to use a structural metaphor, the load-bearing walls. But when they change, through redundancy, retirement, health limitations, or just the passage of time, the effect on identity can be surprisingly destabilizing. It's the predictable consequence of having invested heavily in a set of roles without simultaneously developing a sense of self that exists independently of them. So the man who retires at 65, having spent 40 years defined by his profession, faces a version of the same question that every single life transition raises. Who am I when I'm not doing that? The psychological literature on this is consistent, and it's worth taking seriously. Men who navigate this transition well tend to have a few things in common. They have relationships that exist outside of work. They've got interests that aren't purely instrumental. And they have some capacity, however undeveloped, for reflecting on what they actually value rather than simply what they've always done. So if you're listening to this in your 40s or early 50s, say, that last point is worth thinking about. The capacity for reflection doesn't arrive automatically at retirement. It develops through practice, and the time to start practicing isn't the day you hand your car keys back. Now here's something you might have experienced. Emotional life does get better with age. It's not necessarily easier, but it's richer, it's more regulated. The kind of hair-trigger reactivity of younger years tends to mellow. Your capacity to sit with your difficult feelings without being overwhelmed by them, well, that generally improves. It doesn't mean, of course, that older men are immune to depression or anxiety, because they aren't. And the evidence on male depression in midlife and later years is actually sobering enough to deserve its own episode. But the general trajectory of emotional regulation across the lifespan is broadly positive, and it's a fact that tends to get lost, especially in the relentless focus on what declines. Men in their 50s and 60s also frequently report something that might be described as an increased tolerance for emotional honesty, both with themselves and with others. The energy required to maintain emotional defenses across the decades is quite considerable, and many men find that the older they get, the less interested they are in spending it. This can manifest as a greater willingness to say what they actually think, to express affection more directly, to acknowledge difficulty without elaborate hedging that characterized those early years. In its own quiet way, I'd argue it's a form of freedom, and it's available to you. Now, if you're willing to stop spending energy on defenses that were never particularly serving you as well as you might have thought. Now, this is something I find genuinely fascinating, and it might surprise you. The psychologist Becca Levy at Yale conducted some of the most striking research on aging and psychology that I've encountered. Her findings? Well, we can summarize them as attitudes towards aging, measured decades earlier, predict both cognitive function and longevity in later life. Put another way, people who held more positive views of aging in midlife live, on average, significantly longer than those with more negative views, even after controlling for health status, depression, and various other confounding factors. Now, if you think on that for a moment, it's really saying what you believe about getting older actually affects how you get older. The mechanisms aren't fully understood, but they likely involve a combination of behavioral pathways. People with more positive aging expectations tend to stay more active after all. They're more socially engaged, they tend to be more health conscious, and direct physiological effects of the chronic stress systems that negative attitudes produce tend to be much more reduced. So the man who treats aging as pure decline, who greets each birthday as a confirmation of diminishment, he's probably doing himself a measurable disservice. Now, it's not optimism for its own sake. It isn't the relentless positivity that this site and this podcast make a point of avoiding. It's finding a decent evidence behind it, and it's worth taking seriously. The concept of successful aging has been in the psychological literature since, say, the 1980s. It's attracted its share of criticism, largely because defining success in this particular context isn't terribly straightforward. Early models tend to overweight the absence of diseases and physical functions at the expense of psychological and social dimensions. They tend to imply that aging well meant things like aging without the things that aging involves, which isn't a particularly useful definition. And I think more recently thinking has changed, and it emphasizes adaptation much more. So things like the capacity to adjust goals, reframe challenges, maintaining a sense of meaning and purpose in the face of genuine losses. And this is sometimes called selective optimization with compensation. It's a rather academic phrase for something relatively simple. In other words, identify what matters most, invest in it, find alternate routes, and especially when familiar ones close down. I think it's a much more honest model because it doesn't pretend that aging involves no losses. It acknowledges them while insisting that how you respond to those losses is not predetermined. Men who age well tend not to be those who avoided difficulty or happen to be dealt a particularly good hand. They tend to be those who developed, sometimes late, sometimes reluctantly even, a capacity for reflection and adaptation that served them when it was needed. That capacity is available at any age. It simply requires deciding that the question of how to live well in the years you have is one worth taking seriously. So you might be wondering, what exactly does this mean in practical terms? Well, drill it down to 3 things. Simple to state and requiring genuine commitment to act on. First, you stop treating your brain's processing speed as the only measure of cognitive health, because it isn't. Pattern recognition, accumulated wisdom, the integrative thinking that improves with age, these are the abilities that matter in the situations that matter most, so use them and invest in them. Second, take the identity question seriously before it becomes urgent. The man who retires at retirement, having spent 40 years entirely defined by a professional role without developing anything alongside it, is going to have a much harder transition than the man who cultivates interests, relationships, a sense of self that exists independently of what they do. And the time to build that is right now if you haven't already. Third, pay attention to what you believe about getting older. The Becker-Levy research isn't a minor finding. The man who approaches his 60s and 70s with a genuine curiosity about what they might contain, rather than resignation about what they won't, is not being naive. He is, on the evidence, making a decision that has measurable consequences for actually how those decades go on. So sure, the brain at 60 isn't what it was at 30. But it isn't a degraded version of it either. It's just a different instrument. It has different strengths, it's got different vulnerabilities, and a different relationship with time and meaning that, if handled thoughtfully, produces something that the younger version wasn't quite equipped for. You can call it wisdom if you want. The research certainly supports that term, even if it does sound rather grand. Maybe I'd call it the product of a life lived with sufficient attention to have learnt something from it, which is, if you think about it, exactly what you've been doing. If this episode's been useful, you'll find the full article at drjerrycanard.com. The site covers all of this territory in depth, and everything there's free to read. Now, next episode, I'll be looking at long-term relationships, what the research says about what keeps them working and what doesn't. I think it's probably going to be more honest than most accounts of the subject, and I hope more useful. Until then, take care of yourself and possibly reconsider your position on your next birthday. I'm Jerry Kennard, and you've been listening to The Quiet Midlife.